that if you burn coal and you burn oil, you could generate vast amounts of energy. The human population, which was well under 1 billion people, expanded exponentially until it now numbers 7 billion people worldwide. We covered the earth. We exploited every available corner of nature, all to generate energy to allow human beings to live in buildings like this, to have light like this, to have air conditioning, to fly in airplanes, to drive our cars, until fully 80% of everything we eat, everything we wear, how we travel, how we entertain ourselves, is implicated in oil. We as a culture, we as a human civilization, have become, for all practical purposes, completely addicted to oil. All the clothes that you're wearing today, almost everything, is involved with oil. We did this very happily because it increased our sense of modernness and our distance from nature. Until now, most of us, because of our capacity to harness coal and oil, live abstract lives, completely disconnected from the natural order we now completely dominate. What we didn't understand, what we didn't even know until about 100 years ago, was that the oil and coal that we were burning was going into the atmosphere as CO2. And that CO2, carbon dioxide, was beginning to heat the atmosphere of the earth. To make a long story very short, we are now, every 24 hours, putting into the atmosphere of our earth, all around the world, over 90 million tons of CO2. That 90 million tons of CO2 has been happening for about 150 years, starting in an escalating amount. And every year, particularly in the last 10 years, we've been radically escalating the amount of carbon dioxide going into the upper atmosphere. And all the projections of every research institute in the world shows that we are going to continue relentlessly putting CO2 into the atmosphere in increasing amounts until about 2025, or some estimates 2030. As a result, in the last 50 years, we've increased global temperatures by just under 1 degree centigrade. Now, I want you to think about what that means for a moment. If any of you here had an increase in your temperature by 1 degree centigrade, you would not be here, because you would have a fever that would put you into bed. Because what happens when you raise your temperature and your body has a fever, everything in your body changes. Everything. And if you have a temperature of 2 degrees centigrade, you'd go to the doctor. We've given our earth a fever. That's the best way to understand global warming, is that the earth has a fever of about 1 degree centigrade. So the equilibrium that has been evolved over the eons of time, which, if you know James Lovelock's Gaia theory, has evolved to produce the maximum equilibrium necessary to support life, particularly human life, is now being overheated. And the climate that has given us the support to maximize life on this planet, particularly human life, is increasingly out of equilibrium. And the life that's going to be the most dramatically affected, the quickest, is going to be that life which is at the top of the food chain, at the top of the life chain. And that is us. And again, it's our lack of appreciation of this that constitutes the major part of our predicament. Now, there are many details that can be spoken. I have very few minutes, so I want in this lecture to give you an overview of what is already taking place and what we can expect as we look into the future. Two things are worth noting. Number one, the change in the climate is exacerbating extreme weather events. In the last 25 years, the number of extreme weather events have quadrupled. They've increased 4 times. So what we call storms of a century are beginning to happen every 20 to 25 years. And if you follow the Weather Channel, you'll find that more and more frequently they're talking about record floods, record drought, record rainfall, record hurricanes. And countries like Brazil, who have never had bad weather, never experienced a hurricane, are beginning to experience extreme weather events. Number two, and most fundamentally, climate change is altering our relationship with water. Instead of water being reasonably plentiful all around the world with important variations, now water is falling. The average rainfall is increasing about 1.5% per decade. But instead of rain falling all around the world, rain is now concentrating in fewer and fewer areas and falling more, causing flooding. And that is to a large degree on coasts. But in the inland of our continents, the inland of Australia, China, India, the Middle East, Africa, United States, Latin America, there's less and less water. In my state, where I come from, in California, last year, Governor Schwarzenegger declared a statewide state of emergency because California is now in perpetual drought. The ice melt-off of the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains has declined by 46% in the last 20 years. And even though there may be rain in Mill Valley, where I live, from the point of view of the overall state of California, we are now in perpetual drought. Stephen Chu, who is our Secretary of Energy for the United States government, has predicted that the great San Joaquin Valley, the great Central Valley of California, which for my entire lifetime has been the largest food-producing valley in the world, he has predicted that in the next 20 to 25 years, the San Joaquin Valley is going to be reduced to desert. Australia has lost 98% of its rice crop. Argentina has seen a 50% reduction in its wheat crop. India is facing severe water shortages. China, right now, is looking at a drought that is unprecedented in its north-central areas. And it is looking at the collapse of its wheat and rice crops. The great glaciers around the world, the Arctic, the Antarctic, Greenland, the ice caps of the Andean Mountains, the ice caps of the Rocky Mountains, of the Alps, of the Great Himalaya, are all in recession. The 4 billion people of Asia, China, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, the Middle Asian republics of the former Soviet Union, all get 40% of their water from the Himalayan glaciers. Those glaciers are now going away. Think for a moment, what do people do when they run out of water? They begin to migrate. There are now more water refugees in the world than there are war refugees, by several orders of magnitude. And the number of water refugees is escalating year by year by year. The water melt-off of the Arctic and Greenland ice caps in particular is raising our ocean levels. Let me just say one word about our oceans before I talk about the rise of ocean levels. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, since the beginning of our production of massive amounts of carbon dioxide, the acidification of our oceans has risen by 30%. Every hour of every day, the oceans absorb over 1 million tons of CO2. And the net result of the absorption of CO2 is basically like carbonated water. You know, when you open a bottle of carbonated water, there's those bubbles that come. Those may be good to drink in a glass of Perrier, but it's not good for anything in the ocean that has a spine, a shell. Basically, what we're doing to all those living systems in the ocean is we're giving them a form of osteoporosis. And that's what's debilitating our reefs. And the trend is escalating that to the degree to which we are escalating our production of CO2. In Greenland alone, between 2005 and 2008, over 1 trillion tons of ice melted into the ocean. 1 trillion tons. The net result of that melt and the other Arctic and climatic changes is to begin to increase our ocean levels right now at about 3 to 4 millimeters a year. Doesn't seem like much, but there are 55 cities along the coast of Brazil that are beginning to experience excessive flooding. Mayor Bloomberg in New York convened a commission to deal with the rising levels in New York City, because what they have just discovered in New York City is the subtly, slightly rising oceans around Manhattan are seeping into the earth underneath Manhattan, corroding not only the water supply system, but all the electronic infrastructure that during the 1980s and 1990s, when we didn't want our telephone lines going along our streets because they were eyesores, we put everything underground. And now everything that has been built with billions of dollars in New York is going to have to be brought overground because of the rising waters. Let me give you one fact. If all the ice in our poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic and Greenland, melt, ocean levels on this planet will go up between 75 and 100 meters. Now just internalize what that means. That every major city and port in the world, from St. Petersburg to Odessa to New York City to Sydney to Shanghai to Los Angeles, Seattle, Vancouver, Miami, faces an escalating rise of oceans that won't stop. Because at some point soon, we are going to go into irreversible melt. One of the facts about climate change, about the way the world is constructed, is that if you have a 1 degree increase in global temperatures at the equator, that translates into a 2 degree rise at the poles. So right now, the reason why the Arctic Ocean and Greenland are melting as fast as they are is because even though the global temperature rise is only 1 degree on average around the world, at the poles, it's 2 degrees. Imagine for a moment what this implies for the human race. Drought in the interior, escalating, rising oceans on our shores, complete chaos in the food supply. What is going to happen when people on the coast, where over 50% of the human population now lives, in Brazil, it's 90% of the Brazilian population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. What is going to happen when the real estate market starts to collapse? The seas can no longer be dealt with. I was just in Holland. Holland is already 40% underwater. What's going to happen? You're going to experience the most massive migration of people in the history of the world. And that migration is going to happen at the level of tens of millions of people beginning to move. Where are they going to move? Russia. Scandinavia. Canada. They're going to start to move to the temperate zones. And that movement is not going to be a pretty picture. James Lovelock has written 4 books now, the latest of which is called The Revenge of Gaia, in which he is predicting that by 2100, 90 years from today, this year, that upwards of 80% of the human race will have been killed off or die off by war, pestilence, and climactic disaster. Think of hundreds of millions of people forcing their way into Russia from China, from Central Asia, moving in from the Mediterranean. What would the Russian government do? Think of what we think about immigrants today. When we can control immigration, And what will the United States do when it's not tens of thousands of Central Americans and Mexicans coming across the border, but millions of Latin Americans coming into Texas and the Southwest, which is already being victimized by drought? Let me say one more word, because it gets worse. And how does it get worse? It gets worse because of the methane. One of the things that's happening all across the Siberian plateau is that the permafrost, the tundra, for millions of years has been frozen, which is the reason why they can still find woolly mammoths when they dig underneath the soil. The tundra is melting. One of the effects is your Trans-Siberian Railroad. The tracks of the Trans-Siberian Railroad are increasingly getting warped and have to be relayed. You know this. But all across the Siberian tundra, in the Arctic Ocean, north of Russia, in the Arctic Sea, because the ground is melting, what is seeping up through the earth is methane. It is methane, not CO2, that is going to ultimately do us in. Because methane is 20 times more contributive to global warming than CO2. And methane is combustible. One of the things that happens with increased temperatures is lightning. In the fall of 2008, on one afternoon in California, there was nearly 1,800 lightning strikes in one afternoon that burned over 1 million acres of land. Last year, for the first time ever, scientists recorded lightning strikes even in the Arctic. Imagine what will happen when the lightning hits the accumulated pockets of methane coming out of the Earth's surface. I mention this because the BP oil spill that just happened in the Gulf of Mexico in U.S. territory was the most perfect syncretistic event that I can imagine, that is showing the United States, indeed all of humanity, not only the level of our hubris, our arrogance, but how quickly, suddenly, the earth can turn. BP drilled 5,000 feet down under the ocean surface. What destroyed the platform? It was a bubble of methane that came up through the pipes. And the people working on the platform were cooking their dinner. And when that methane met the fire, the entire thing exploded. What more perfect warning could we receive from the earth about what we're doing to ourselves? And we're doing it in a way that is irretrievable. Once global warming escalates beyond human control, there are no more cycles of history. There's no more world as we know it. We have to take this in. And we need to understand that these kinds of decisions, the magnitudes of these decisions, which are ultimately spiritual in their base, have to be made within the next 10 years. And if we do not make the requisite decisions, our children and our children's children are going to be condemned to a nightmare of existence without end. Meaning for the next several million years. when we may survive as a remnant that will remember back some age in which human beings prospered, but because they so wantonly and promiscuously and ultimately intentionally squandered the gifts that nature provided, they condemned history itself and spirituality itself into a very dark night of the soul. I'm not giving you a fantasy of my projections. I'm trying to articulate the latest scientific evidence about the effect of human activity on this planet. So, what is to be done? What is to be done? I think the most fundamental realization to which we must come is that ultimately we are acting as we are because of the metaphysics that undergird human consciousness and spirituality. And here I must be provocative. If I had to identify the most toxic thought form that is contributing to BP being allowed to drill as it drills and us ignoring the messages that are coming from the earth herself. Because as a believer in the Gaia theory, I believe that the earth is intelligent. I don't believe that what just happened with BP is a pure freak of nature. I think there's synchronicities in human life. I also believe there's synchronicities in Gaia. And as all the ancient scriptures say, the earth groans with human agony, yearning for the day of our redemption. We're in a communication. We're in a symbiotic relationship. The earth is speaking to us. And I think one of the things that we have to re-examine as fundamentally as we can is the assumptions that are embedded in our Abrahamic traditions. Our Abrahamic traditions, radically monotheistic, produced a miasm of the human spirit, I think finally we need to confront. When Judeo-Christianity said there is one God, what did they do? They took a worldview that was polytheistic, that infused nature herself, humanity itself, with divinity. And they took the notion of sacred right off the earth. They the net effect of radical monotheism is to radically desacralize the earth. And once you've desacralized the earth, what is the command in Genesis? Have dominion. And for several thousand years, our civilization has treated the earth as if it's inert, as if it has no life, as if it can be exploited and manipulated and carved up and destroyed without consequence. Because we believe in God. We believe that somehow we're chosen. And so we have lost our capacity to reverence the very earth out of which we came. And with our fossil fuels, we've managed to construct a civilization that is completely disconnected from the earth. So we don't even know the consequences of our actions upon the earth. And because the CO2 is invisible, we're ignoring the CO2 just like we ignore the earth. So the most fundamental challenge that all of us need to engage in at an intellectual, at a spiritual, at a existential level is to re-sacralize the earth. We must all become polytheists. We must all understand that nature is alive. That whatever divinity is with us, in us, through us. And there is no outside. And we have to live that resacralization of nature. The participation mystique, as Eliade put it, in an urgently, existentially crucial way. The second point I would make, given the synchronicities of history, given the spirit that guides the affairs of humankind, I think it is not coincidental that in the last 50 years, as we have now moved history to the brink of undermining civilization as we know it, that there has been emerging in civilization a new value proposition. And many of you know the work of Paul Ray and the cultural creatives. It's just worth noting that as our crisis has been escalating, so has the consciousness that could solve the crisis. Paul Ray points out a number of things about the cultural creatives. But there are three aspects to which I want to draw our attention. Number one, at the core of the phenomenon of cultural creatives around the world, and every study in any country has produced the same results, such that there is more commonality between a cultural creative in Russia and a cultural creative in the United States than a cultural creative in Russia and a fellow Russian. Unprecedented that an emerging value system would emerge spontaneously around the world and look exactly alike. And one of the characteristics is that the cultural creatives have begun the process of disengaging spirituality from religion, which is exactly what we have to do. 50 years ago, 75 years ago, if you were spiritual, you were a Jew, you were a Christian, you were Russian Orthodox in this country, you were Protestant, you were Muslim. But the universal characteristic of cultural creatives around the globe is that they're disengaging spirituality from the strictures of religion. And as I just indicated, that is a crucially important phenomenon to underscore and to implement. Number two, they embrace ecology as the container for technological and economic development. They're very gifted in technology. They use iPhones. They're very much involved in the entrepreneurial economy. But everything they do is within the context of ecological wholeness. That's crucially important. And number three, which is the challenge. Everywhere cultural creatives have been interviewed, they all think they're alone. So even though they're numerically the largest value group in the United States, for example, at between 25 and 30% of the population, also in Europe, also in Japan, and also in the major metropolitan areas around the world, because the media, because the political institutions, because the major business and corporate institutions are controlled by the conservatives or the modernists, the cultural creatives are a timid bunch. They believe that their spirituality is still a private point of view. And they haven't come to terms yet, they haven't woken up to the fact that if they came together, they would be the most powerful moral and political force in the world. My time is running out, so let me make two quick points in conclusion. I would say that we need to expect two things. Number one, as you look into the future, understand without any doubt that we are moving into a future of escalating turbulence. There is no more normalcy. History, time, spirituality, culture, values as we have known them and evolved them since the beginning of humankind are going to be under an escalating threat that is only going to increase in its intensity. So number 2, watch out for the weather. Pay attention to the climate. Become aware of the consequences of human activity. And if anyone's interested in being on an email list, maybe we can work out with Vladimir, because Paul Ray ferrets the internet and sends out emails just to keep people informed. The single most important quality of cultural creatives is that they're more informed than their peers. Become informed. Pay attention to the news, particularly the climate news. And live consciously. Live as consciously as you can in a realization that the earth is sacred and that we have an obligation. And so what that means, if you want to live consciously, is that we all have to become personally responsible for the climate. Spirituality needs to shift from a belief in God, a belief in spirituality, to a new relationship with the earth and the climate of the earth. We all have to become personally responsible for our climate. Everybody in this room, everybody you know, should go on the internet and do their carbon footprint. Find out how much CO2 you are personally and your family and your community are producing into the atmosphere. Use it as a benchmark and do everything you can to reduce your carbon footprint. Talk about it. Act about it. Let me conclude with a quote from Martin Luther King, which to me summarizes both the possibility and the urgency of the present moment from a spiritual point of view. It was written shortly before he died. He says, "We are faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood. It ebbs. We cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage. But time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. We are faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood. It ebbs. We cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. If we understand these words, that we collectively as a race are running out of time, we will be as conscious as we need to be to transform life and history, to preserve time. But our time is running out to do that. Thank you all. Did I take the whole hour, or is there time for discussion?
Ну, у нас уже нет времени на вопросы и ответы, к сожалению, но на сайте Конгресса вы можете найти ссылочки, там, где рассказывается о Джимми Гаррисоне на State of the World Forum, на Горбачев Foundation, а также Wisdom University, президентом которых является Джим Гаррисон. И больше узнать о его деятельности.
Oh, yeah, we know it.
Okay. Tomorrow, yes, but